Hello and welcome to Hamer Reviews. My name is Christopher Hamer and today we're going to be doing a bit of a pre-review of the Nikon Z6 II. Now the Nikon Z6 II launched just over 2 weeks ago and that's how long I've had mine at home, and it's been really fun using it because it's not quite as similar to the Z6 as its physical appearance might lead you to believe. Now, in terms of physical appearance, there really is very little in it. In terms of looking at them from the front on, I think you'd be hard-pressed to notice a difference. Obviously, this has a Z6 II emblem, and this one just has a Z6 emblem, but beyond that, there really isn't much of a difference. However, if you were to turn this to the side, you would notice that the memory card door is very different because it's much larger on the Z6 II. The reason for this is that it has dual card slots, something that so many people have been screaming for. Personally, I have probably given enough commentary about the single card slot on the Z6. It doesn't bother me personally, but I'm glad that Nikon has addressed a criticism that so many people had in the Z6 II and Z7 II, and now you have dual card slots if you need them. Other physical attributes, well, there's some really small ones. So you'll perhaps notice that the camera body's ever so slightly thicker by about 2mm, and it weighs about 30 grams more. I honestly think you'd be hard pressed to notice, but that's something that you might want to know. There are other subtle changes as well, and that is the buttons in some places have been refined. They've been angled at slightly different angles, perhaps to make operation slightly easier. I didn't really notice on a day-to-day basis, but it's things like the record button being angled slightly more downwards and some of the D-pads and so on feeling slightly different. So yeah, there are small changes. The bigger changes are inside the cameras. The original Z6 had a nice amalgamation of video features and photography features, and the Z6 II obviously carries that forward. But what it now has is 2 of the XP processors that the Z6 had inside the Z6 II. These 2 processors allow for some rather interesting things. So first off, we now have eye autofocus in video mode. This isn't actually something that was possible on the Z6, despite the fact that I thought it was when I bought one. So I was a bit disappointed when I initially realised that I wouldn't be able to use IAF. However, now with the Z6 II I can in video mode, and I think that's great. Other enhancements to the video side of things are you now have 4K 60 frames per second, or at least you will have when Nikon unlocks it at the start of next year via a firmware update. The Z7 II, which launches in December, is apparently going to launch with that already. So interesting that the Z7 II is getting a bit more in terms of features than the Z6 II is at launch, but that will be coming. You also have HDR, so high dynamic range output via HDMI on the Z6 II. Now, I think that is really interesting because, again, that's something the Z6 couldn't do, and I kind of can't work out why not. I think it would have been fine, but the Z6 II can do it, and that's giving people that shoot video, such as myself, a few more features to play with, and play with it I absolutely will. It is worth noting, though, that as with some of the other video features such as N-Log, you will need an external recorder to make use of the technology such as high dynamic range recording. Something like an Atomos Ninja 5, which is what I use, is probably going to be what you need, but it's worth bearing in mind that if you do need HDR, you will need that external recorder as well. There are other features as well, such as the 14 frames per second, up from 12 on the Z6. Enhanced tracking and general autofocus improvements, which I have noticed and I really have been enjoying. And there's also smaller tweaks like shorter blackout when you're taking photographs. Now for me, that shorter blackout is probably one of the things I've noticed most when taking photographs, and it has been incredible. It's made the camera a lot more usable when taking sports photography. So for instance, I've actually got a review of the Nikon TC 2x teleconverter, which I've been using with the 70-200 2.8S and the Z6 II, and I went out and took some surfing photographs, kite surfing specifically, and the Z6 II could just keep up in a way that the Z6 couldn't. The autofocus was more sharp more often. I had far less photographs that I missed, And overall, I think the autofocus is where you have that significant improvement. Now, there's another reason why I've been enjoying using the Z6 II as well, and that is USB power. And that's a really, really small thing, but you can actually plug a power bank into the Z6 II and it will power the camera whilst you're using it. Now, I do have the MB-N10 battery grip, which gives you 2 batteries and lasts so much longer than this sort of standard battery does inside the camera, and that's great. But there are occasions where I want even more battery power, and that is actually made possible through the USB-C power option that you now have with the Z6 II. I've been using that a fair bit, and I think it's actually a lot more clever than you think, because you can plug it in, you still have the battery in the camera, so if that USB power bank fails, it doesn't matter, the camera just switches straight to battery and you don't notice. But you can get power banks of, say, 20,000 milliamp hours, which is way higher than the built-in battery that you get in a Z6 II. And I think that makes a big difference in terms of using the camera, especially when shooting video. That being said, you are then starting to create quite a cumbersome video setup, and you're going to have to think about how we're going to attach all these things to the Z6 II. But you know, there's solutions out there, various different cages that you can get that make that possible. Ergonomically, I haven't noticed a difference with the Z6 II over the original Z6. They both just feel good. It's one of my favorite cameras in terms of ergonomics, other than the Nikon D300, which I still think is sort of peak ergonomic levels for Nikon's cameras. But everything's just snappier, everything's a bit quicker, probably because of the dual processors. And I don't know whether I'm just drinking the Nikon Kool-Aid, but I'm a lot happier with the Z6 II than I thought I would be. And I feel like all those small tweaks have made a massive difference. Another YouTuber that I was watching actually pointed out a really cool but small feature, which is that if you actually extend the display out, so for instance you're shooting from the waist and you're using the display as your monitor, it actually switches off the eye sensor, which usually switches over to the electronic viewfinder. So before with the Z6, if you had the screen out and you had something, say for instance, just sort of resting against your clothing, it would switch off the big screen that you were using and switch over to the EVF, which obviously because you're looking downwards you couldn't see. And I think those kind of small improvements are certainly going to be appreciated by a lot of people that might otherwise have been annoyed by them, to be honest with you. So the autofocus is definitely better. It just is. I'm finding I'm getting much better shots. The autofocus in video is a heck of a lot better. And yes, fine, there are people comparing this to Sony and Canon's. I haven't used those latest cameras. And I'm sure they are extremely good and probably better than the Z6 II, because I think the video autofocus is something Nikon has struggled with. But personally, I've been very happy with it. I found, generally speaking, that the autofocus on these videos are all right. I'm currently using the Nikon Z50 to record this, and I haven't had any issues with that, and I certainly haven't had any issues with the Z6, the original version. But I think the Z6 II with the IAF is hopefully just going to get a little bit more precise, a little bit sharper occasionally, but overall I don't expect that it's going to make a massive difference to these videos. I'm just glad that when I do need it, I can get much sharper focus if I need it in terms of the IAF. Lastly, I just want to address the memory card thing one last time. I said I wasn't going to, and I'm going to. There are obvious benefits to now having Compact Flash Express, so CF Express cards in this camera, because you can now, I think, use them at full speed. So I made a video using a CF Express card in the Nikon Z6, which was upgraded by firmware to allow the use of CF Express versus XQD. And I've been playing around with the Z6 II, and I think that it's making full use of the CF Express card. So there's definitely an interesting change there. And obviously you now have the SD card slot as well. And I think for a lot of people that are maybe upgrading to the Z6 II from another camera, having the SD card slot there might make this more interesting, because you don't need to go and spend a huge amount of money on a Compact Flash Express or XQD card, because they are still very expensive in comparison to the rather cheap SD cards that you can get. So there are benefits there, but if you are going to use CF Express cards, I think this camera is using them much faster. And in combination with the bigger buffer, I assume made possible by the new processor, you can actually get 134 photos rather than the 34 that you got with the Z6. So that's another small change that is noticeable. And actually, when I was doing that test with the teleconverter and the 70-200 2.8S, what I did notice as well is I wasn't filling the buffer. With the Z6, I filled the buffer a lot, especially when taking nature or sports photography. It's very easy at 12 frames per second to fill it up. With this, I didn't fill it once, so there's another benefit. If you need to take lots of photographs in short succession, Z6 II is going to be a lot better. Obviously, you also have the Z7 II that is launching, in December. That's, again, going to have a lot of the same improvements as the Z6 II. The main one that obviously difference between the two is that the Z7 II has that 45 megapixel sensor, whereas the Z6 has the 24 megapixel sensor. That's down to preference and down to what you're shooting. If you're shooting video, I still think this is a better choice, though it must be said that when we do get the 4K 60 frames per second, it is going to be cropped, whereby the Z7 isn't cropping it. I don't understand what's going on there because that's reverse of what we've usually had. So just bear that in mind if you shoot video and you need to use 4K 60, Z6 II is going to be cropping your video. So those are my initial impressions. I think I'm going to be doing a longer video or a more in-depth video in the coming months or even weeks, just to give you a bit of an update on things I've found with the camera since I've been using it a bit more. But initially, I'm very happy with it. I was thinking that if I didn't enjoy it, I'd probably return it, but I'm definitely going to be keeping hold of it, and I might, unfortunately, get rid of the Z6 because I can't really justify having both of them alongside the Z50. So I'm going to keep the Z6 II, let go of the Z6 once I've finished all my comparisons and other videos like that. And then, I think that it's going to be an interesting ride with the Z6 II, and I look forward to seeing what Nikon does in the future, especially with regards to the lens roadmap, where I think there's some gaps that need to be filled pretty soon. But overall, very pleased. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about the Z6 II, pop them in the comments and I'll either address it in my full review or I'll respond in the comment section. Equally, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. The other button works too. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It really helps the channel and I really, really appreciate it. Thanks very much for watching and I hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.